Welcome. My name is John Kelly, Vice President of Technology Strategy at Neustar, the leader in information services. We're here today to talk about a thought leadership paper that was written by Forrester but commissioned by Neustar, and this paper is about how to differentiate with privacy-led practices. And we have today with us for this conversation Fatemeh Khatibloo from Forrester, Senior Analyst, who covers the privacy, identity, and trends around consumer-managed data, as well as Becky Burr, the Chief Privacy Officer at Neustar. So I wonder if a good place to start is just ask the question, what is privacy? I think historically we might think of privacy as a derivative of the concept of freedom. Right? So maybe it represents the boundary around the self. We usually think of it in terms of maybe your home, but I think you might also think of it in terms of a privacy as a boundary around your personal self. The sort of the distinction between the public person and the private person, what you have a right to know versus what I have a right to keep to myself. And nonetheless, I think therefore if it's about that right to know and it's about that distinction, maybe it also sort of contextually changes from generation to generation depending on the technologies and the capacities and what's relevant for that generation and that time. And so maybe a lot of the question today would be, what is privacy today as relates to that sort of more general concept as derivative from freedom?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that privacy is undergoing a total redefinition. And I think we hear the trope about privacy being dead really often, but I don't think that's true. I think it's just being redefined. Right. And for me, privacy is really about the agreement about the data and knowledge and whether what I've given you and what I've agreed to share with you is being used in a way that I expect and agree to.
Now, I think, though, the kernel is not changing, but context makes right. It mean something different. So when Brandeis was talking about the right to be left alone, he was talking about, paparazzi walking down the street and taking pictures of you. It's very external. I still think that the issue is about control, and it's a little bit harder and more complicated to know what's going on and to know what control you have. And when you look at the research, consumers report that they are worried about controlling, about being in charge of deciding what's out there and how it's used.
I think that's a great point about control. And what we've seen in the research, and the research that we did for this paper, is actually that consumers have opted out. So nearly a third of consumers, for example, use things like do not track and ad blockers on their devices and their computers. And then even more than that, nearly 40% have actually opted out of transactions because of something that they read in a privacy policy that they didn't like or didn't agree with.
So do we think that's because end users are just becoming more savvy? Or are they just a little bit confused and unsure of what the policies mean? Do they think that the whole aggregate of loss of privacy across the online world is getting to the point where it's like a tipping point? I mean, what do we think is driving that high percentage of things like do not track and ad blockers?
Well, I think there's a lot of news in the media. It's a very visible issue right now. When we see the kinds of news around things like Target's use of data to identify a young girl who was pregnant, that scares us a little bit. It makes us pretty anxious, and so I think we try to find ways to protect ourselves, and I think that's what's borne out in the research. This idea of trying to disintermediate how much people know about me and how they use the data that they have about me.
So this goes back to your earlier point about whether privacy is dead, right?
Exactly.
Maybe it was really just, it seemed dead because end users weren't really fully caught up yet with the technological shift.
Yeah.
But maybe it's coming back now as people get savvier.
So of course it's also a product of the fact that, for 10 years, people have been disclosing their privacy practices. And, at first not so well, but increasingly in more granular terms and more sort of in your face and just in time. So there's also an education of consumers that's going on that's not just press driven, but also intentionally driven by policy that talked about transparency and disclosure.
So Becky, back to the point of the research that you mentioned earlier, the surprising part there was only 35% of people were doing nothing. everybody was either doing an ad blocker or do not track or something. So they're all trying to do something. So it's almost as if you have now a situation where people are looking for what's the next way to think about privacy. There's been a certain amount of pressure building, I think, in the marketplace, but people don't really have anything that they can do that's really constructive.
Right, except that this is an opportunity for companies, and I think that's the really interesting part of the research, is that we are really at a moment where there's an opportunity for companies to take, to meet consumers at their request for having options, having choices, and differentiate themselves, appeal to consumers on the basis of empowering consumers to make choices about their privacy and their information.
So insofar as brands can sort of align themselves with that pressure that's growing in the marketplace, they can take advantage of what consumers are asking for.
Right, it's pressure, and it's clearly pressure from sort of bad stories.
Sure.
But it's also an opportunity for educating and differentiating.
I mean, I think we've seen business history of this, right? The market has changed and adapted to what consumers have wanted. So I think things like environmental friendliness and sustainability movements and eco-friendliness, back in the early 90s, the entire recording industry changed its packaging policies for CDs as a result of pressure from environmental groups. That was a very vocal and small minority that made its voice heard and changed the way that market operated. And I think we're sort of at an inflection point for that to happen with privacy.
So just picking up on that, because I think that's a really interesting, it started with the Sierra Club, but consumers were aware of that, consumers watched that, consumers were educated by that, and they started behaving in ways that favored more environmentally responsible products. And so we've seen that in a whole bunch of other things where, it may be an external force, it may be a regulator, it may be an advocacy group, but the education is sort of a two-way, it goes two ways.
Mm-hmm. I also think that brands need to understand that it's not that people don't want to be known, it's that they want to maintain their privacy. There's a difference between anonymity and privacy.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, when you walk into a store and you buy something, you want to be known. You want to be tracked with that purchase so you can bring it back if you ever want to or whatever. You don't necessarily want to be followed around the store and have someone with a magnifying glass seeing what you're looking at and what you're not looking at. So there's a difference, and maybe it's a difference of degree, but I think it's a substantial difference in the end between anonymity and privacy. And companies, I think, have to get more subtle in thinking and understanding and being respectful of people. And I think respect is probably in the end what it comes down to.
Right. Trust and respect, I think, are the two big, and transparency. I mean, I think we talk a lot about this, but the idea that you're willing to share what you're collecting and how you're using that data is really important. It's an important piece of privacy, and I think to your point, if I know that they're sort of watching me as I'm walking through the store, I might be okay with that if I know that it benefits me long term. I'm most definitely not okay with them watching me when I leave the store and going to see where else I've walked around in the mall.
And you certainly would be okay if you found out after the fact that they had been following you around.
That's exactly right.
I think the other piece of the research that bore this out, which I found fascinating, was, and surprising and confusing at first, was consumers didn't mind if their personal information was shared by a company with another company, but they really mind if that company sells that information. Now, you could say there's not much of a difference there, but I think it comes down to how the person has been objectified and productized, right? When their information is being sold, I think the dignity of the person just gets lost there. Whereas if one company is sharing your information with another company, that just seems like people sharing information with people as opposed to selling me.
Yeah.
And there's something different about that.
The other thing that the analogy for me with that is scalping tickets. And I feel like this idea of an aftermarket for tickets, event tickets, feels pretty good to most people. But the idea of scalping and profiteering on what I have and so on, it feels unpleasant, and it feels like you're taking advantage.
Right, the exploitation element, but it also is the uncomfortableness with data being with us being the product. So I think that's a really different information is the product. And so lots of things are being crowdsourced, and we are the crowd.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I think also as consumers have gotten more savvy about how valuable all this information can be about themselves, they're wondering whether or not this bargain is fair. They're regarding a bit of an asymmetry here,
That's
right? And I'm not sure what to make of that exactly. It's not that I think people want to monetize their own personal information in any fashion, but I don't think they like that someone is taking their personal information and using it to so much of their own benefit that it doesn't feel like I got enough out of the deal.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure what to make of that, but.
Well, another interesting piece about the research was where people thought the value was going in terms of this, and they thought that your name and an email address was more valuable than demographics or preferences or that. I mean, it's very interesting. It's not how the market prices the value of this information, but it does, I think, speak to the notion of of people not being uncomfortable with you knowing things about you, but having this sort of permanent record attached to you that follows you around and is associated with your name and your address. It's a different matter.
Yeah. It's the other thing that's really interesting, so you just touched on this idea of sort of like a record in perpetuity, right? When we've done this research in the past at Forrester, some of the things that we've seen are, the big concern is always about identity theft, right? I don't want my data collected because I'm afraid that identity thieves and bad people will get a hold of it. But in this research, we found really interestingly that about 40% of the people that we surveyed actually didn't want a permanent record of their activities and their behaviors. There was still a big chunk that had identity concerns and identity theft concerns, but that other piece was significant, and I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, there were lots of kinds of information that we've given away always, that people have given away, and we want the people that we interact to have that information. But you had more control when it was more transient, when there wasn't a permanent record of the fact that I walked into this store today and bought this kind of detergent.
There seems to be a sense of, when I walk into a store and the people in the store know me, or I've been there before, or they at least can see what I bought last week, that sort of thing. It feels like, okay, they're helping me. They're here to make my experience better, as opposed to when people are trying to figure out what I'm thinking without me even noticing, without me even knowing. Now it feels like they're trying to trick me into something, or they're trying to exploit my weaknesses or something like that. And so that goes to the transparency and trust point that you made earlier, right? And so insofar as brands can present themselves as, I'm actually here to make your experience better, I'm not here to trick you or exploit you, insofar as they can get on that side of the ledger, they're really going to be trusted long-term by that customer.
What you're talking about is so interesting, because the holy grail for so many companies is the relationship with their customers, right? And we've had CRM in place for years and years. What we're doing isn't relationships, and this idea.
That's a very good way to put it.
And so I think this idea of sort of differentiating with privacy and privacy-led marketing means we get an awful lot closer to the idea of real customer relationships.
Right. We're treating people like people.
That's right.
Yeah. Right. So how do brands lead with privacy? How does that work? How do you do things differently from what has been done so far?
Yeah.
Well, I think the first thing you do is you be very as transparent and as clear as you can be about what your practices are. I think there's no reward for pulling your punches in a privacy policy. You have to work really hard to make it understandable, and you have to think carefully about what is and is not anticipated, and that's hard because the technology is complicated. But I think the very first thing is telling people what you do in a way that they can understand.
One of the things I talk to a lot of our clients about is actually, even before going to that outer place and the public-facing place is figuring out your internal privacy framework and your internal privacy standards. I think you've got to know sort of ideologically where you want to be, and you've got to get your entire business on board with it. And it can't sit in, you know, security and risk. It can't sit just in marketing. It has to be across the board. And I think you have to sort of decide who you want to be as a business from a privacy perspective.
And you have to do that over and over and over
That's
and
right.
over again if you're in the technology business.
That's
You
right.
have to regularly sit down with a bunch of the, you know, people across the organization to say, sort of, what do we want to be in this space?
That's right.
What's okay, what's not okay? What are the boundaries given the technology today?
And Becky, I know that you've actually been a leader in the sort of privacy by design movement. I wonder if you could explain a little bit what that is and how that would relate to leading with privacy.
Well, it's Anne Kavukian, who's the Data Protection Commissioner in Ontario, sort of coined the phrase. And it's a very sensible phrase. You start at the beginning of the product design when you are thinking about it, and you think about, and I always say privacy and security by design, you think about that all the way through. So your product development, you know, just the design, the requirements documents, all of those things. You know, as Neustar's Chief Privacy Officer, I'm busy writing agile user stories on privacy and security for our software development, and that's it's not the after the fact you know, sheriff who comes in to close the door, but being part of the product design.
I think products can actually get better and more interesting when you do that.
Well, you can certainly differentiate yourself, and it's not just, by the way, differentiating yourself in the consumer market. That's very important, but also, you know, our customers are businesses, and their customers are concerned about their privacy, and we distinguish ourselves by understanding that that's a pain point for our customers, and we need to respond to it, and we need to give them tools to be responsive.
Yeah, one thing I find interesting is a lot of our customers come to us and they say, well, that's because, of course, we do help customers market to certain segments in the marketplace. And they come to us and they ask us, show me the algorithm you used to get to that demographic or to that whatever. And we have to actually be able to show them very clearly not only where we got the originating data, but then how we used it through that. We can't just throw it all into a big data algorithm and have some fuzzy logic and have something magic come out the back end of it. We have to actually show them how it all worked. So through practices like privacy by design, we can actually show technologically and process-oriented why this is how we got to that conclusion.
It also requires a little bit more precision about telling people what you get to in the end. So you're not just, you know, saying magic marketing words about you're going to know your customers and do everything. You know, you really are talking about sort of what the data sources are, what your thinking is, how you derive the insights, and what they mean.
Right. I know that a lot of our customers are asking for that, not just so that they know what it means, which is really important, but they themselves are concerned about, wait a minute, if I hire some company to help me with this and it turns out that they have violated privacy or whatever, now you've smeared my brand. Right? So I think a lot of companies are already very sensitive to that but they're sensitive to it. They haven't thought about how to use it to differentiate themselves yet. So they're reactive to the privacy problems, but they're not proactive yet about how to use it to differentiate themselves.
I think that's dead on, and I think you know, I think a lot about the sort of calculus of privacy and doing privacy better. And I think on the consumer side, we've talked a lot about this. It's about sort of delivering value and being transparent and giving them choices and options. On the business side, you're right. There's the differentiation piece, but that security and safety piece for the business is huge as well. There's a lot of cost in remedying bad privacy practices, and I think when you get down to brass tacks, if I don't have to store a piece of data in perpetuity, better for me. I mean, there's the basic cost of not having to manage and protect that data, but there's also what happens if that data does fall into the wrong hands. I don't have to worry about that in the same way if I do good privacy.
And you know, the research actually shows that people really don't want little bits of information to be kept for long periods of time. They don't mind if you keep it for a short period of time, but they really dislike it when you keep it for a long period of time. And it's interesting, I think the value of it deteriorates anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, this little bits of personal information, unless it's really like name, number, and address, most of the rest of it is pretty perishable, right? And so if you can find ways to discard that information quickly and easily, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Right, and it doesn't mean you have to discard sort of what you've learned in the process, but you are the sort of granular bit of data that says this person did this on this day is what people don't want.
Right. The research shows that people don't want anyone to keep it. And it turns out that if you build your products properly, you don't really need it anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
that's right.
We've been talking about this, theoretically, but Forrester did a very interesting research paper. I think it would be useful to know a little bit more about what you found and what Forrester found in the research and what the conclusions and recommendations are.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll set a little baseline in terms of kind of the methodology and so on. We actually did online surveys with U.S. online adults and a very statistically significant sampling of them, and we were really careful to make sure that it was a representative group of online Americans. So these are people who are active online, they shop often online, and we really wanted to understand what their attitudes and perspectives were. And I think one of the main things that came out of it for me was that consumers absolutely do differentiate between how companies are using their data. You alluded to the sharing versus selling. We saw many outcomes on that and many different scenarios where they clearly said, we don't trust certain companies to protect our data. We especially don't trust the companies that hoard our data and sit on that data for years and years. So I think, that's one of the big takeaways here is if we think that consumers are starting to respond and react and protect themselves, then the more people believe that companies aren't trustworthy, the more they will protect themselves. And so I think companies are going to be kind of disintermediated again. So that's one thing that I think is really interesting. The other is that we asked some questions around what types of companies people would like to shop with, and we tried to be very non-comparative about that. So we split the sample into an A and a B group, and we showed them a scenario for the way a company that they might do business with uses their data. And so it wasn't a comparative analysis, it was just one or the other that they saw. And there was a very clear statistical difference in the way that a more privacy-led company garnered trust and got people to recommend that company to their customers, to their friends, and so on. So clearly, consumers differentiate, and they understand the differences in the way that people are using data and how companies are collecting their data, and they make shopping decisions on that basis. They actually do vote with their dollars.
So I think it's important to clarify on this. You're not suggesting that the companies that knew less about me got better ratings. You're suggesting that the companies who were simply more respectful of my privacy, even if they were able to still personalize, were the ones that got the better ratings.
That's exactly right.
So how does one do that?
Right.
How does one personalize while still being
That's
very
right.
privacy sensitive? That I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think so we're talking a lot about behavioral targeting and ad targeting and so on in this context, right? And we think about the different ways to do that. I think this idea of buying all kinds of information about your customers and building these massive databases and appending hundreds and hundreds of attributes to them, it doesn't really benefit the business. I think the idea of doing segment-based targeting and segment-based understanding of demographics and psychographics is really as valuable. So I think that's one major way. I think also, again, to Becky's point, the idea of transparency and talking about how you're collecting data, how you're using data, and where you're sharing that data is incredibly valuable for brands to do.
So for brands that do in fact lead with privacy, what sort of benefits can they expect? It's not just the avoidance of bad.
Right.
What positive can they gain as a result of this? They're going to gain higher levels of loyalty and trust and long-term customer relationship and a better, deeper relationship where the customer is probably more likely to now actually divulge information than they were before, because now they're not afraid of it being misused.
That's exactly right. You know, we talk a lot about preference management and preference centers as a really good example of this. So some of the businesses that collect consumer preferences and give their customers a chance to say, not just opt in or out, but opting down, frequency, what kinds of products they're interested in, what their intentions are. You know, they're not having to do inferred behavior and inferred intention anymore, because their customers trust them enough to actually tell them.
So it's really a relationship.
It really
not
is.
just a fear thing between
It
the two.
is. It is.
So Fatemeh and Becky, I wonder if you have any concluding remarks, final thoughts about this thought leadership paper and the conversation that we've been having.
My takeaway is that we've been hearing that privacy is dead and everybody should just get over it and forget it. That's not what consumers are telling us. Consumers are telling us that if you approach them on the basis of privacy, if you give them choices and show them directly that you're respectful of your privacy, you will win loyalty and trust, and you will differentiate yourself in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on what Becky said, I think that companies need to stop thinking about privacy as a cost center and really think about it as a place to drive better relationships with their customers.
And just to add to that, I was actually shocked at the rapidity of change. I think a year ago, we would have gotten very different results to this same exact research questions. And I wonder whether we'll see even more acceleration as we go forward in this direction. It'll be very interesting to keep track of this. So thank you, Fatemeh and Becky, and thank you all. And if you'd like a copy of this thought leadership paper, you can find it on neustar.biz.